Adoption, and co-author of the books, Adoption Unfiltered and The Root to Rise Yoga Teaching Method. She's host of the podcast Adoption, The Moral View, and all of which has made her a student of grief, of the science and practice of attachment. Lori's done a lot of work in the area of grief, professionally and personally. She has a very personal connection to man's mission, which you'll all hear more about. Thank you, Lori, for being with us today.
I'm full of gratitude for all of you for being here, and I'm filled with even more sorrow and compassion that you have a need and a reason to be here. As Colette said, my name is Lori Holden, and I come from a family of 15. This does not mean I have loads of siblings. It means I have 2 parents. I have 2 children. I have a husband. Not in that order. I have 2 sisters. I have 2 brothers-in-law, a niece, and 4 nephews. And these are my people, and they take up much of the front 2 rows. Plus, I have more extended family members as well as friends from this job, that stage of life, this activity, that experience. And I'm not young, so I've had lots of jobs, stages, activities, and experiences. I have lots of people who I love and who love me. Let's take a moment just to imagine your people, the ones who you love and who love you. Being surrounded by so many friends and family members means that even with the loss that brings me here today in my past, I still have lots of possibilities, probabilities for loss and grief coming for me in my future. The only way for me to cheat that grief that's surely on its way here is to die before my loved ones do, which merely serves to offload the grief to my loved ones. It's a no-win, isn't it, being a human who loves? In my 20s, my beloved childhood dog, Scuffy, there's a reason behind her name, she died and it wrecked me. I asked a group of old people at work, people who are 20 years younger than I am now, if you get better at grief from practicing it, from going through it over and over again. Those who had experienced the death of a loved one tried to comfort me, telling me their stories of the losses they had survived. In answer to my odd question, one wisely said, "No, you don't exactly get better at grief, but come back to that." Talk about wrecked. 842 days ago, the world of those 15 people I mentioned was shattered with the loss of my nephew, thanks to a drunk and impaired driver. You can find Dominic De Palma on page 41 of your hymnal or book. That moment, 7:13 on an otherwise beautiful and promising summer evening in 2022, rearranged the cells in our body, the stars in our constellation, and the very fabric of what we knew life to be. I realized I didn't get my slides going. Can you advance this? Can somebody advance this slide? And as hard as this has been for me, finding my way in this new reality, I am experiencing it 1 degree removed from the intensity with which some of my loved ones are experiencing it. While this has been extremely hard on all 14 of us who are left behind, the hardest part for me has been watching my sister and my son grieve and knowing there's very little I can do to alleviate their suffering. My sister Tammy is Dominic's mom, and my son Ronan is Dominic's best friend. Technically cousins, but functionally brothers. As my son so poignantly said at Dominic's eulogy, they were supposed to speak at each other's weddings, not at their funerals. So while I am an experiencer of grief, I am also an observer of grief. I've been trying to figure it out ever since Scuffy died, and later my grandparents, motivated now more than ever. And the way I'm built, that is when I struggle with something, thank you. When I struggle with something, my strategy is to research the hell out of it. So here are 3 things I've come to understand about grief. Number 1, grief is real and grief does not stop. Our brains are hardwired to form attachments. In fact, current thinking in the fields of psychology and neuroscience say that Maslow got it wrong in his hierarchy of needs. Physiological and safety needs don't come before attachment needs are addressed. Attachment instead is foundational. It's first level. Attachment is required to get our physiological and safety needs met. Attachment keeps track of our most important relationships across 3 dimensions: space, time, and depth of connection. This is according to Dr. Deborah Davis. She takes cues from the book The Grieving Brain by Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Dr. Davis explains that when we are attached to someone, our brain develops an implicit knowledge that that person is everlasting. Without this implicit knowledge, life would be unbearable. We'd be thrown into panic, grief, and seeking every time we were apart. Instead, with an implicit knowledge that our loved one is everlasting, we can rest assured. We can function. Even when we're not in the same space as our loved ones, we remain bonded to them, and we subconsciously and constantly ping them. Think about a mom on a playground. She can be talking with her friends, and once in a while look up to see that her child is there, safe. Her ping is answered. There's a safe zone of time and space for mom to feel comfortable, even if the child isn't within sight. She can rest in the fact that her child is here, close, and safe, until they aren't. When the kids grow older, the pings may look like getting a text back from her teenager. They're okay. Or mom can check on them on Life 360, and see that they are where they're supposed to be. They are safe, until they aren't. A husband knows that his wife spends her days at work. She sometimes makes a stop or two on her way home, and she usually walks in the door around 5:30. All day, the husband can rest assured about his wife, trusting that she is safe and sound in her routine, until she isn't. Every night, a 4th grader and her dad read a chapter prior to her going to sleep. He slips out, and she hears her parents watching TV in the other room, and maybe laughing together as she drifts into her dream time. They all wake up in the morning to breakfast as usual, until Dad doesn't. Panic sets in. Why isn't my ping returned? What the heck is going on? Will my child be found? Will my wife come home? Was yesterday the very last breakfast I'll ever have with my dad? No sign of the pings amid our frantic pings. The attachment we were once able to take for granted is now at risk. After the panic comes the reality: a child found safely or not. A wife walks in the door or not. A family has breakfast together or not. Our brains are always seeking connection to those we love. And when that connection cannot be made, the seeking doesn't stop. This is one of the reasons why I'm sure you found that grief is so exhausting and all-consuming. Your brain is working constantly, trying to find your loved one. Have you realized that? I'm here to validate your fatigue. I see your exhaustion. Your brain got the memo that the ping volley isn't going to be returned, but it simply cannot make sense of a senseless memo. So it keeps pinging. Pinging takes energy. Expecting a ping back drains the energy you have in your daily battery. Getting out of bed some days can take all the energy we have. In the immediate aftermath of our loss, I observed my sister, her husband, and their daughter function almost robotically as they survived those early days. A bubble of care and compassion encompassed them. Their grief was honored and validated by everyone around them. To the degree people could shield them from any additional hardship, such as even deciding what to have for dinner, they were protected. You might be able to remember yourself in the immediate aftermath of your own loss. Teachers encircled Dominic's sister, ever tuned into her emotions, in constant contact with her parents. They avoided anything that could trigger her, and they were accepting when she was having an off day. Dominic's parents were given grace as they got stuck in basic functioning, much less in trying to move forward. Every person in the world recognized first that they were grieving, and they were accepting when Tammy and Gino weren't capable of living up to the abilities they once had. As an aunt, I miss my nephew terribly, and yet I consider myself a secondary griever, 1 degree away from the grief intensity of Dominic's parents, sister, and cousin brother, the primary grievers. Like so many of Tammy and Gino's people, I stand ready to step in during times when they can't do life. Today, even 842 days after, the bubble of protection remains around them, though the intensity of those early days is not as essential as it once was. Secondary grievers like me, I see you too. I see you in the second, third, and fourth rings of loss. I honor you doing the things, lightening the loads, showing up to do whatever, whenever. Secondary grievers, we help, support, protect. We do it from a place of true love, not from a place of expecting anything back. But we secondary grievers also have ongoing wounds from the loss. Ours may not be the white-hot grief of those in the center, but orange-hot and blue-hot are still pretty dang hot. As we tend to others, are we also tending to ourselves? Paradoxically, tending to ourselves is essential to being able to care for others. Ours may not, this is really dark up here. In our caregiving, we can lose sight of our own need for healing. And the further we are from the center of the bullseye, the less our own grief is acknowledged and recognized. At some point, people may no longer see our pain, our enduring pain. They don't see our grief, our enduring grief. Our grief can become disenfranchised grief. What does that mean? Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not acknowledged, validated, or publicly mourned. After our designated and acceptable period of bereavement, we are expected to function at work again, to be on task, to meet deadlines, to forget the pain, to move on. Our pain as secondary grievers has an unspecified expiration date, after which it may no longer be recognized or validated. So I'm here to validate your pain too, secondary grievers. Your feelings of sorrow and exhaustion are real, no matter how long ago your day one was. I honor your grief, which is evidence of love. I hold space as you remembered your loved ones, and I take a moment to tune into that place in your heart that they occupy. Let's send the very generous and relentless hearts of our secondary grievers some loving kindness. Back to the pings. The pinging may never go away, but the brain is malleable and can rewire away from the constant pinging. Fortunately, there are conditions we can create and pursue to support the rewiring process. This brings us to number 2. Processing grief is about proportions. You may enter into a grieving process thinking that over time, your grief will shrink, that as you experience it and even process it, it will gradually abate. Sadly, this is not true. Grief stays. Tammy tells me that she naively thought, if I do a yearbook page, it will hurt less. If I go to the high school soccer game, it will hurt less. If I do a media interview, it will hurt less. If I write a victim's impact statement, it will hurt less. None of that worked, she reported. All is not lost, though. Grief won't always be the biggest thing in your life. How can that be, you may ask, when you just told us it will not shrink? That can be because processing grief is done through proportions. More specifically, changing proportions. While your grief may not ever lessen, your life around it will continue to grow. I'm not sure what, is there is there somebody there who can?
I swear it's working.
I know, it was. That's okay. Then I can't see. I know. Okay. All right, thank you. So if you're looking at this picture that I'm seeing there, in the top row, you may think that the grief symbolized by your heart will gradually shrink. But what you'll notice on the second row is that your life, symbolized by the jar, can continue to grow in relation to the grief that stays the same. Dr. James Hollis, a psychoanalyst, says that transformation is about enlargement, but enlargement generally comes from suffering. How we all wish there was another way, right? But seeing that enlargement offers a way through our grief, let's look at ways to pursue it, which brings us to my third point. Ways to grow our jar, ways to rewire. What are some ways to continue to grow? When I was sitting in the grief of infertility many years ago, experiencing both ambiguous loss. How can I grieve a person who never actually existed? And disenfranchised grief. No one brings casseroles to someone who can't make a baby. The life I'd envisioned was over, but life itself was not actually over. How would I keep going? Somehow I intuitively knew a few things that would keep me afloat, and in the intervening years I've added to my list. Various research studies bear out the value of these ways to grow your jar through grief. Could I have a slide advance, please? The first way is community. Be with people, like today. Your people. Be careful with this, because you want to be with people who support you, not people who you end up consoling. I don't know if you had that happen to you, where somebody comes up to help you feel better and you end up calming them down. Be with people who get what you're going through, like a support group. Make sure it's one that's monitored for healing on the way up instead of wallowing in grief on the way down. I'll also caution you that community can mean let's get together over drinks. Well-meaning people may offer you invitations to happy hour, not making the connection that your loved one was killed by someone who drank and drove. You do not have to say yes to situations in which you find yourself among people who drink and then drive home. Instead, you can find other creative meanings for getting together, like having coffee or tea, going for a walk, or meeting at a park. Number 2, slide advance please, is therapy. As Tammy said at the court sentencing hearing of the driver, I cannot imagine a time when we 3 are not in therapy. Get professional help from others who can guide you, who have studied griefology and who can help you make some sort of sense of your grieving process. MAD has resources for this. Ask them on your way out today. The next one, slide please, is be in nature. Nature heals. According to UC Davis Health, there are significant benefits to our brains for being outside among natural elements. Natural elements have longevity. There's an eternal nature to them. They help us reposition our lives within a greater context. The earth, the mountains, the canyons, and the rocks that we have here in abundance in Colorado, water, creeks, rivers, lakes. If you get to go to a coast, you can sit by the ocean and hear the waves lap like breathing, like the earth itself breathing. Air, the sky, the eternal rhythm of the sun rising and the sun setting. Our forests, we have various types of trees and all the life that they sustain. Other types of ecosystems, and our sun and our moon and the stars out there. We know that a vista is good to look at. It's good for our eyes and our brains in ways that being contained by 4 walls is not. Horizon gazing helps us to switch off the stress responses, according to Dr. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist at Stanford. Gardening. Get your hands in the dirt. I'm so grateful to the grief gardening that Tammy has been able to do through a local place called She Grows. Once a week during growing season, Tammy joins others who are grieving in tending a flower farm, being in the dirt, observing the life cycle of plants, seeing the beauty of the dahlias and the opposite of beauty of the pests, help soothe and integrate her brain. Plus, she's doing all of it with people who get it. You don't need a flower farm. You can create your own garden or volunteer in the neighborhood one, and you don't need to already love gardening. Your life has been shaken like a snow globe. Things that didn't used to appeal might appeal now. The 4th thing is movement. Big emotions are best kept in motion so that they don't get stuck somewhere in us. So try solo activities like running, biking, dog walking, or yoga. Turn any of those into group activities by doing it with someone else. You can add in team sports like pickleball or golf, Zumba, or other kinds of dancing. Bonus points, then you're also using community. Hiking is also in nature. The 5th one, slide advance please, would be to volunteer. Get outside yourself. Being of service to others can help your jar grow. After we adopted our daughter, I was once again in the limbo of the wait for our 2nd child, the one who became Dominic's best friend. To help me keep my mind off my own troubles and calm my anxiety, I volunteered with a hospice organization. I took my then 18-month-old with me to visit those who were nearing the end of their lives. It was a healthy perspective shift for both me and for those we visited. Consider volunteering with MAD. You may find, like Tammy does, that doing so supports her grieving process, offers her community, and besides, it feels meaningful to help others. Meaning is one of the things that grows our jars. The next one is to create. Try throwing pottery. I don't mean at the wall, I mean like on a wheel. Painting, choreography, writing, poetry, event planning, collage making, music, composing music, making, decorating your space, planting, creating a fish tank or a terrarium. Insert your interest here and run with it. And like I mentioned before, even if you weren't into doing something in your before days, you might find that it's a worthy activity in your after days. The next one is to mix and match. Combine therapy, movement, and or creation for double benefits. So you could take therapy and have therapy and movement would be dance therapy. Therapy and art would be art therapy or music therapy. Therapy in nature could be horse therapy. Movement in nature could be hiking, walking, a trail, skiing, horseback riding. Insert your thing here. One of my sister's saving graces has been doing all of these things with people, such as her Walk Like Mad team, where she had 50 people by her side supporting her and fighting to stop the madness. She's fond of saying, love shared is multiplied, grief shared is divided. One thing to be mindful with all of these activities is all the doing. You don't have to do all the things every day or even every month. There's a natural cycle of activity and rest. Honor both. A rest cycle is just as important to integrating your after reality as is an active cycle. Some days your one thing to do will be to rest, and your body will let you know. Honor that, but also be mindful not to be overindulgent in any of these building a life around your grief activities. On the topic of finding rest, I'll also add the last one, make time for stillness. Busyness can actually keep you from feeling and metabolizing grief, always at a rate that is intolerable. For ancient traditions around the world to the neuroscience of today, we know that making space for just a few minutes of non-activity, outside if you are able, can soothe and heal a tired and pained nervous system. If you make this a practice, you are supporting your brain in its rewiring efforts. So let's bring things together. Advance, please. Science has established a few things about grief. One is that it's real, that it does not stop, it is in everything we do, and it is exhausting. Two, that while grief doesn't lessen, we can grow around it. And three, there are many, many ways to prompt and encourage our growth around our grief. You may feel uniquely unlucky, solitary in your grief, but Dr. O'Connor, the grieving brain, says, grief is a universal experience. None of us will get out of here without experiencing it. When we can connect, it is better. In other words, instead of running from attachment, which we cannot, what helps is to invite it into our lives, to allow community to help us heal. This is why I'm so proud of each of you for making it here today, in the community that no one wants an invitation to. So let's revisit the question I asked all those years ago. Do we get better at grief? What I've come to realize is that grief is not something you do. Grief is something you build a relationship with. Once again, relationship is everything. As Dr. O'Connor points out, grief is a noun, and grieving is a process. Grieving means that our relationship to the grief changes over time. At first, grief has you. It's bigger than you, stronger than you, deeper than you. But you are not static. No seismic event, again referring to nature, like an earthquake, a flood, a tornado, or a wildfire, retains its intensity forever. With time and with a continual commitment to growing your jar, you can modify your relationship with grief and change its size relative to your life. Your full life, not limited to this horrible, awful chapter. Slide advance, please. I challenge you, even with your broken heart, to tend to and grow your jar in whatever ways work for you, maybe even in ways that delight you. It's possible to create connections, to indulge in passions, to find meaning, even in a story that nobody wants to be a character in. It's possible, encouraged, slide please, to grow your life and fill it with things that matter. To do so is a way of honoring your loved one, not evidence of leaving them behind. Slide, please. Take those steps, as big or as small as you are able, to make that happen. As Claire McIntosh says in at least 18 different ways in this book, as well as in its very title, I promise it won't always hurt like this. Slide, please. And slide, please. And I wanted to point out The Grieving Brain. These are two books that have helped Tammy, have helped me understand Tammy, and I would highly recommend them. Take these steps, as big or small as you are able, to make that happen. And thank you for being here. I wish you well growing your jars.
Thank you so much, Lori. Your message is of passion and inspiring. Next, I want to invite Matt, Colorado's founder, Barbara Grote, up to the stage. Barbara.